Good afternoon. This is the Board of County Commissioners Board Work Session. This is a regular meeting. It is Wednesday, February 27th, 2023. It is 2:03 p.m. The session is set to go until 3 p.m. This is a hybrid meeting. We're at 3000 Pacific Avenue Southeast, room 110. For public virtual attendance, you may follow along on the Thurston County YouTube channel. I'm Carolina Mejia. I'm the chair of the board. To my right is Vice Chair Ty Menser. To my left is Commissioner Gary Edwards. Also in the boardroom, we have County Manager Rivera Chavez. And we're back with the Community Planning and Economic Development team, and Director Joshua Cummings, as the rest of the staff, are going to present on the Shoreline Master Program update.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Commissioners. Good afternoon. This is a continued conversation item. Where you left the board was maybe last summer, about August 2022. We received a recommendation from I believe from the Planning Commission, which included a minority report, as I recall. And as the board reacted to that, there's a very complex item that requires a lot of conversations, perhaps to a detail more so than you're perhaps willing or like to do it. But I think it deserves for you to go down to the level of detail to determine what the recommendations of the Planning Commission and what options you may have, and some of the key elements as at least where we see from the staff level. Although today we stated that perhaps a decision is requested, but rest assured we will not be asking to make a decision on this very comprehensive, complex plan. What you will hear from the staff today, and I believe that was a request of the board, is to give you some tools, a decision matrix. They can help you globalize the conversation and also exercise your individual decision-making process on key elements of this plan. So today, you will hear that decision-making matrix the staff has prepared, and they will walk you through what that matrix includes. Although at the end of this hour, I will ask the board to take that matrix with you and go through how you would like to exercise your individual votes in each of those items. And we will be scheduling a follow-up briefing that we will get down to the level of detail and as a way to move forward. Because I don't think it will be fair for you, at least I'm speaking from on your behalf perhaps, for you to exercise a single decision on a global context of this process, because it's extremely complex. And the staff has done, I believe, an excellent job in itemizing some of the key elements of this plan, perhaps what the recommended options by the Planning Commission, and perhaps what are the options that you have. And in between is what the Department of Ecology, how the Department of Ecology plays a role on the whole process. So with that in mind, that's probably my initial statement of this next hour. If you have any questions about my statements, then I will turn it over to Josh and his staff.
Any questions for the county manager? Thank you. That was a great, I think, introduction and kind of setting the stage. We know this is complicated. This topic has been in one way or another on the docket since 2009. So it's been a heavy lift. We've had 33 Planning Commission meetings on this topic over the years. And we wanted to honor the understanding that this is a complicated topic and to provide a decision-making matrix for the Board of County Commissioners to help take these next steps. What we've also done as staff that's been relatively novel is to work to continue to find new ways to facilitate a conversation and to provide a global perspective, as the county manager said, on why it matters and what each decision point is. And so ecology has been a part of this conversation since the beginning. They're watching all of the meetings and the conversations. Staff, our CPED staff, has worked to engage with them to receive their perspective, because the end of this process is whatever plan, the Shoreline Master Program, the plan that the board recommends to submit to ecology, it's up to ecology to approve or not. And so in this decision-making matrix, we actually have a sneak peek of what ecology's position will be. So when you're looking at this matrix, we're gonna go through an overview of the whole program. and then what this tool is meant to do. If there's things that we can do better, our job is to facilitate and provide the information that the board needs to work through these items to make decisions. And we're learning with you. So we know this has been a long time coming from our perspective as the facilitators. This is a big deal that we've gotten to this stage of the game where we've got a planning commission recommendation. The work that the planning commission did to go through each one of these chapters was a heavy lift as well, and really appreciate their work. This is now a time to continue that conversation. And we know that there might be more details that need to be ironed out. So like the county manager said, we're not looking for decisions on each one of these today, but for you to understand the process and how we can have that conversation is the goal for today. Anything more to add before you jump right in, Andy?
I don't think so.
Okay, questions, commissioners, or get going?
You know, maybe you're gonna cover it, but does this cover, I see like, just glancing at this, you got a 250-foot setback from streams. Is maybe that was what ecology, I don't know. Anyway, so does it cover commercial logging operations?
So let us do the presentation, we'll
it's
get into
gonna
the
be in there?
details. That's a good question. Thank you for that, we'll make note of it and come back to it.
Okay.
And how did the decision points in the PowerPoint, the 5 areas, relate to the very more detailed?
Yeah, we'll cover that.
Ask any more questions and we'll just say, we're gonna cover that. Let's get going and then we can have time for more details at the end.
Here we go, all right. Good afternoon, commissioners. I'm Andrew DeFovis. I'm a senior planner in community planning. Here today to discuss the Shoreline Master Program update as county manager and my director have outlined. And get your feedback or begin to get your feedback to help refine the Shoreline Master Program draft. County has been updating its SMP as a requirement of state law. And this is how local governments implement the Shoreline Management Act and govern development and redevelopment on our shoreline. This briefing is a follow-up from an introductory briefing provided to the board back on October 19th, 2022. Here we go. So here's an overview of what we'll cover today. We'll do a little bit of project background and some of the process to date, and also talk you through some decision points that we've prepared for the commissioners. Any guidance provided by the board today or at follow-up work sessions will be folded into the next draft of the master program, which ultimately would be the subject of a public hearing before the board. And then we'll talk about some next steps that come in the process after that. So initial work on the master program began back in the late 2000s as the director indicated. And the first round of background documents were published in 2013. A draft was then prepared for Planning Commission review. So between 2017 and 2022, the Planning Commission held 81 work sessions on the Shoreline Master Program and 1 public hearing, ultimately making a recommendation to the board in August of 2022. So we provided a background in October to the board and are now here to dive in deeper and build toward a public hearing ultimately. Okay, so this slide here, you may notice in your packet, it may look a little bit different than what's in your packet. I took some words off so it's easier to read on the screen. But we've essentially prepared some information for the board around major decision points. These are things, represent big topics that have come up in the process to date, and also items that were identified by ecology during their informal review of the document, things that may come up later during the approval process. So there is a table attached to the briefing that lists out the various discussion points, which are broken into 3 categories. We're really only going to focus on the first category today. So there are many issues. We tried to let the biggest ones rise to the top. So we'll go through those today, but we have that attachment to your briefing for your reference and to study and to use as a guide in future work sessions.
So that's the answer to your question, is the main decision points are in the PowerPoint. They're on the decision-making matrix at the front, and then there's broken out more detail above that. It's separated with that gray band for the heading.
And the second band says ecology indicated required items. Is that something that's not in there and they think should be in there?
So that's the second bullet point on the slide 4. So the 3 sections of your decision-making matrix are main decision points, ecology indicated required items, ecology indicated helpful items. And so, yes, ecology indicated that the second section is items that are required.
So in total, it's a matter of 68 items that we're gonna be reviewing at the end of all the different work sessions. I'm hearing. there's
Yeah,
gonna be
the
more
main
than that.
decision points are at the setbacks that, Commissioner Edwards asked about, all the top ones that have been the hot button issues for a long time. Those are the main BoCC decision points. But we wanted to provide you all of the different nuances and input that we have received.
But you're gonna ask us ultimately whether or not to include, for example, the ecology required items in the draft that goes to the public.
That's correct,
So we
yeah.
kind of need to go, I mean, we can do it on our own time, but we need to go through all those items.
That's
think-
exactly right.
Yeah, I think the hope was that the board would take the matrix and then at a further work session, we could come back and explain more context of any of the ones that you wanted to have more information on ahead of that public hearing.
Okay.
So yeah, so today we'll talk about some main decision points, which are really items that have been big topics to date or things that have received a lot of public feedback and that we'd really like to get board feedback on. And then there are those ecology indicated required items, which are things that through the informal review, ecology has indicated are likely to be required before they would approve the SMP. And then the third category are ecology indicated helpful items. These are things that would help improve clarity or efficiency or implementability of the SMP and help ensure protection of the shorelines, but may not be required changes.
I'm hearing that may be required or may not be required, or ecology might not. And we've been working on this since 2009. So, I mean, obviously, we're not up against a deadline per se. They're not gonna fine us if we don't get it done tomorrow or next month or whatever. Is that right? I mean, we're not, it says in here, our ideal time for a decision is March. Is there some up against a hammer somewhere that I don't see, or?
No, there's no specific timeline, but we're hoping to move it forward and adopt an SMP, that as we're required to do by state law.
So there is a couple of pieces. We are required to do it by state law. And second, the Board of County Commissioners has asked us to move things forward in a timely manner. So really, it's the Board of County Commissioners and deadlines on however much time you would like to spend on each one of these items. We are inconsistent with the state guidelines currently, and that's why we continue to want to make sure that we have progress going forward.
So what happens if we submit something that's, I don't know, ecology says they want it in there? What happens?
So that's up to ecology, and what we've tried to do is outline on each single one of these items, ecology's position. And if ecology decides that the county did not submit a draft or a plan that meets their guidelines or standards, then they won't accept that and we'll be out of compliance with the state mandated guidelines.
We're out of compliance now, aren't we?
But we're showing good faith and working towards coming
Yeah,
into,
but we'll still be working towards it. We'll just be out of compliance.
definitely. We're not out of compliance right now.
But remember, the Department of Commerce put us out of compliance on a couple of items 2 years ago.
Mhm.
And the result of that is we couldn't access any state grants. So in this case, since I believe we have shown a good effort that we're working on that's taken a decade, if not more. I think showing a good effort that we're moving forward to having a product to be approved by ecology is what they're hoping to do. But if we submit a product that is not accepted or approved by Department of Ecology, then I believe at that point is the Department of Commerce will put the county out of compliance.
Well, ecology might just come back and say, well, no, you gotta do something different here. So we'll take it back and work on it another couple of years.
Potentially.
Yeah, and we haven't had our formal review yet. I've been working with staff, ecology staff throughout the process to try to shape something that may be acceptable at the end of the line, but they will do a formal stem to stern review once it all goes to
And
them.
I guess I'll go back to my first question that I asked. Are we treating everybody the same on everything? Every landowner in Thurston County?
It depends on where they live. Like it's a different kind of shoreline in different places.
Okay, a creek. So I'll go back to my first question, 250 feet. Is it, the farmer, he can't do anything, or the other landowner, but the big corporate guy, he can do whatever he wants?
So the rules and regulations in the SMP are for all permittable activities within those shoreline designations. If it's a single-family homeowner, if it's an agricultural operator, or if it's a commercial industry, they all have to follow the rules and regulations that are within the SMP.
Let me get Commissioner Munster and then I'll come back to you.
So if we were to, so I put most, since I got these materials, I put most of my brain power to the top 5 there. There was enough there to chew on. But in all these other items, I mean, if the board were to say, yeah, I mean, it's probably smart for us frankly to say, if ecology says it's required, it should at least probably be in the public draft. So if we were to say, yep, just include all this because there's, you know, they got to approve it ultimately, and now we have a window into their thinking. How much work is that for you guys? I mean, if we just say, yep, take this packet, put it all in there because ecology says, is that a year of work? Is that a month of work?
It's a month or less,
Really?
I would say, yeah. Yeah,
A lot of these things seem kind of detailed, you know, provide standards for dimensions, for boathouses, for flood reduction measures, for dredge disposal. Those all sound like kind of like complicated things.
Yeah, and we've been given, so my conversations with ecology have been a mixture of meetings with staff over there, but also they submitted written comments as well. So I've got some of those things, and in between that and notes, you know, we're fairly well positioned to incorporate those things, should that be the pleasure of the board.
That's relieving.
Okay, Commissioner Brooks.
I guess as we move forward then, are we, and here's where I'm coming from with this. For years, I've been trying to get the state to pay attention to commercial fertilization in the forest. Because if you go look at what they're doing now, they fly over the forest with a helicopter and they're putting water, they're putting urea 46, I think it is. They put it right in a creek. Right, they say they stop before they get along the river. They can't even see these drainages as a general rule. And I want to make sure that they're not getting some kind of a break on this because they're doing damage to the environment much more than the homeowner with lawn fertilizer or something. So I couldn't get what was that group we tried to get them to do the upper Deschutes?
It was the Capital Lake Estuary.
Yeah, but it was EIS or
That was the Department of Enterprise Services.
Enterprise Services. Couldn't get them to look at it. Couldn't get ecology to look at it. So I want to make sure that we don't put an undue burden on private landowners and let the corporate boys off. So I just want assurances from you folks that that's not going to happen, that that's not in here. Everybody's held to the same standard, no more dumping chemicals in any waterway, it doesn't matter where it is.
Does the S&P address chemical dumping?
I don't believe that timber operators that are on state permits, I don't believe they are subject to the Shoreline Master Program, just like they're not subject to.
So they can continue to contaminate while other landowners cannot.
They're subject to the rules that DNR would authorize. They're subject to those permits, not necessarily to county permits. But we'd be happy to bring back some more information about that. And
I mean, it's gonna depend on how I vote on any of this stuff, if we treat people fairly. And the fact that somebody's getting paid off up at ecology, I'm not interested in that. I want everybody to be treated the same.
So I think what Andy's saying is these rules apply to our jurisdiction.
Well, I'm talking about places in Thurston County.
But it's our buddies DNR that gives them an end around, not ecology.
Well, I don't think there's a law that says they can dump stuff in the creeks. And if we're gonna do this, I wanna make damn sure we're treating everybody the same. It's the one way, hopefully, I can get something done about forest application. Cause they're killing birds, fish, the whole works. Okay.
So we've set the stage on the tool, and then the next part of the program is to talk about the main points. Are we ready to do that?
Yeah.
Yep, or the board?
so as I mentioned, we'll go through each of the 5 top major decision points outlined in the briefing. So the first one is shoreline buffers, which buffers are a fundamental piece of the Shoreline Master Program. And they were broadly discussed by the Planning Commission and the public. Buffers in the draft Shoreline Master Program have changed over time. In early drafts, many buffers were larger than what you see in the Planning Commission recommendation. As of the Planning Commission recommendation, buffer ranges for marine shorelines and for lakes are smaller than they were in earlier drafts, and stream buffers remain the same as earlier drafts. But the buffer system goes beyond just how big is the buffer and includes the types of exceptions that are made for those buffers and in what circumstances those are made. So ecology staff have indicated in looking at the PC recommendation, Planning Commission, that the proposed buffer widths are justifiable, provided that we make additional revisions to the text to ensure that any buffer reductions are the minimum necessary to accommodate the proposed use and are limited in those situations where those are authorized. So that's a very quick summary on a very complicated issue. And there's more information, I believe, on the, included in the matrix, but I just wanted to tee that up.
So essentially that is saying, because what we got into before was what does staff think? This isn't what CPED staff thinks, this is what we think in conversations with ecology, what ecology would accept within the draft that we submit to them. And I think that Andy's done a good job of bolding the high level is the buffer scheme is within the realm of justifiable, but it says if you've got sideboards, essentially. And the details are always really important. But that is a good first indicator that those big numbers that the Planning Commission recommended could potentially be accepted in the draft that we submit by ecology. And that's how you read this tool.
So my question, Andrew, is like, how did we land like on these numbers, right? Like, how was it that the planning commission came to this recommendation? Was there kind of like a scope, it can be between like this number, or was it just open?
Yeah, we took the Planning Commission through, we did a background briefing long ago on buffers, and including the science surrounding those. What are the buffer widths that are appropriate for the different function you're looking at, water quality or habitat or shade for the stream, things like that. So, the Planning Commission used that information, and they also used feedback from the public and also looking at what other jurisdictions have done and what's been approved by ecology, and kind of synthesized all that information to come up with the range of buffers that you see in the Planning Commission recommendation, which are within the range of things that other jurisdictions have done, and potentially is a supportable approach from ecology's viewpoint with the appropriate sideboards.
How,
So with the chair, I wanted to make sure that, given that was a question about Planning Commission, if the board would like to hear from the chair of the commission.
I would just say
Can you
that one of
please
the other things that-
introduce yourself, sir?
I'm sorry, I'm Eric Casino, and I am chairing the Planning Commission this season. One of the other considerations that we had on some of these buffers is what is currently being used as a buffer, and that informed us quite a bit in our decisions.
Thank you, Chair Casino. Yeah, I would say that the stream buffers and the buffers from a lot of marine shorelines, those were set in the critical areas ordinance update back in 2012. And so the Planning Commission was weighing that piece as well, whether to retain those, whether to differ from those now that shorelines is going to be updated.
So that was the baseline, was the 2012 CAO?
I'm sorry?
The baseline was the 2012?
2012 and the SMP. So it's buffers today, and the 2022 are a mix of the CAO and the 1990 SMP. It just depends on which exact environment you are speaking of.
It matches the left-hand column of what's recommended then?
The left-hand column is the Planning Commission's recommendation. So the stream buffers today are R250. That's what they are. And then,
So go through.
what does that mean?
Yeah, he did it quickly in the initial presentation. Go through each one of them and how they're different or the same. So 50-foot shoreline residential, you said, is reduced?
so today, if you are living on Puget Sound or you're living on a lake and you're shoreline residential, which is the most heavily developed shorelines, those are 50 feet today. So the Planning Commission's recommendation is consistent with today's rules.
Keep them the same.
I'm the same, isn't it?
Correct.
Question on that, for the 50 feet, is it like 50 feet from,
From the ordinary high water mark.
so is it like, does it count up, does it count straight, like how does it work, right? Because where does these 50 feet like come into play?
Do ordinary high water?
It is so it's measured horizontally back from the ordinary high water mark. And that is the point on the shoreline where when someone goes out and looks at that, they can say, this is, traditionally, this is where the aquatic environment begins and ends. This is where the upland environment begins and ends. It's an identifiable mark on the shoreline that says, you know, this is where the water begins and ends for regulatory purposes.
If you had a 45-degree slope, so if you're gonna go 50 feet, it'd be 50 feet here, not, it's 100 feet, you know, from the water line to that same point.
So the water rises and where it's the highest normally, take that point and with the first one, the shoreline residential, 50 feet into the water.
What if there's a bluff, like there's a water?
Yeah, it's, I believe it's measured on a horizontal basis back so that it's consistent.
Right, so you take that point in the water and you'd go parallel with your bluff, and then you'd take 50 feet back from there,
Horizontal.
horizontal.
And then, so,
Is that
okay,
right?
so there's three numbers here. There's where we are today, there's what the planning commission recommended, and then there's been reference to earlier draft numbers. And why is there two numbers there?
Because those are lake/marine. It's
Oh.
lake or marine. Yeah,
Lake/marine.
yep, and I took the streams out of that BoCC decision point for now, just because the PC did not, they kept the original recommendation, they didn't change anything, so I was trying to simplify it for the board. But did you want me to go through those other buffers on the left, or?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So right now,
Sorry, real quick. Is that what the planning commission understood in the way that
Yeah,
it was
I-
measured?
The only thing that I would add to that is that there's more than just the SMP that will protect those areas. So it's not just 50, like if you're concerned about the bluff, it's not just 50 feet horizontal. You still have the critical areas ordinance and steep slopes and those kind of protections that are going to protect that bluff. So this seemed like the best way to go forward with it when we know we have other protections.
that's a very large topic, critical areas and shorelines, that's, oh boy, be here all night. Okay, so looking at the Urban Conservancy shoreline, so that one, today, if you're on a lake and you're either conservancy, you're urban or rural, those buffers are 100 feet. And if you are on a marine shoreline and you're conservancy, your buffer is 250 feet today, and that was from the 2012 Critical Areas Ordinance.
Like, if they're building a house, it seems to me they still use adjoining properties as the barometer, so this one's 30 feet back and this one's 50 feet back and it's within a certain distance. I don't know what that is right now, but I think it's several hundred feet on each side. Then they're doing some kind of an average. How does that fit?
I would have to look at what the draft does to bring you that information. At one point, there was information in there about limiting or using other properties around you to control the view protection. So you put your house somewhere to preserve the views on those properties, and that has changed over time. So I'd have to bring some of that information to the follow-up as to how we actually look at that. Because I understand your question to be, the buffer's 250 on paper, but there may be other circumstances that change where that structure is actually allowed to be. Is that right?
Yeah, and how do we be fair, I guess, there's a fairness issue there on one property and the value of that property, maybe versus the one that's 20 feet away from the water. Those are all issues that come into consideration.
Sure. Yep, I can bring back more information on that.
And so, again, just in terms of process and tools, having those conversations, researching, getting more information on your questions, more detail, we're open to provide whatever you need to dive into each one of these topics. But we wanted to make sure that we highlighted them as the main decision points. So if there's specific questions we can answer on that one, excellent. If
That one meaning,
the number one, shoreline buffer widths, is there more information that we need on that one right now? To write the questions down to come back?
yeah, I'm not anywhere near being done with number one.
Just as an introduction of the topic, not as a completion of the
Well, okay.
details.
Okay, so can you finish what you were doing and we'll go through natural?
Sure.
now?
Yeah, for natural, right now, if you are on a lake and you're in a natural environment, it's 100 feet. And if you are on the marine shoreline, it's 250.
But the planning commission recommendation doesn't distinguish between lake and marine, is that what you said?
Correct. The planning commission recommendation would apply a 200-foot buffer.
So they increased it for lakes and they decreased it for marine.
Correct.
Okay, and then on the second column, you say it might be valid depending on what you see as you develop the cumulative impacts analysis. Can you explain what that means?
Yep. So one of the pieces of the submission that we will give to ecology is an analysis of what would be the cumulative impacts on the shoreline of implementation of this master program. And so if all the lots in the county were to develop, you know, given the rules that are outlined in that master program, what would be the cumulative impacts on the shoreline? Are we, you know, hitting no net loss, those sorts of things. And so that is a piece of the process that has not yet been completed. We're waiting to see, you know, what is the draft that we're likely to end up with look like, and then we would complete that cumulative impacts analysis.
So how would that work? I mean, they look at the numbers and they say, yeah, that might be okay, but then what? What are you gonna show? What would you show them that would make them go, uh-oh, those numbers aren't gonna work because what? Because we've got too much land in the shoreline residential designation and there's gonna be I mean, what would cause them to use the cumulative impacts analysis to overturn their previous blessing of the numbers?
I think they're gonna be looking at, yeah, what, you know, to what degree are the shoreline environments changing? So you're going from one to another, and what are those buffers? So how much land is potentially could be developed versus would not be developed if this plan was implemented. And I know they're also looking for things like how we word, it's the devil in the details, how we word the specific development standards. And do we include things like ensuring that if we are gonna allow an encroachment into that buffer, is it the minimum necessary? Are we doing those in very limited circumstances that we're spelling out? Are we applying mitigation sequencing? All of those things to ensure that we're meeting that no net loss standard.
Because some of the things I know in later decision points, it's like you set the buffers, but then people can get variances and then they can get them, you know, there's limits on what kind they can even get, and then what the process is by which they get the variance, and all of that can play into, I would think, okay,
Absolutely.
so that answers that. Another question I have is about, and again, this has gone on for so long that, and now all of a sudden, and I brought this up with you guys, I think, in private conversation, but it's like, now we've got a flurry of activity in the legislature. You know, there's the governor's riparian task force, and there's site potential tree height that some of the tribal groups are promoting, and I'm wondering, how does that fit into this? And could we do all this work and then the state law just basically says, no, you've got to use site potential tree height, which is a totally different methodology for calculating buffers.
Potentially, I think that is a risk of not completing the updates. There could be changes in state law that we have to go back and take a look at. But we are implementing based on the laws that are currently in effect and on the books for shoreline management.
But flip that a little bit, what if we didn't do anything and waited for the legislature to pass their things and then wrap that into? I think, is that kind of the question?
Well, I don't wanna wait, I just think that, and I'm not criticizing anyone, because how would 3, 4, 5 years ago, the planning commission known what all this, you know, they were going with best available science, and that's been evolving to some extent, or the thinking on that's been evolving. I'm just struggling with like some of these. I mean, the buffer is, I know one of the, as you said, one of the most important pieces of this whole plan. And, you know, like just take a simple issue like lakes versus marine. You know, I know some plans don't distinguish, some do. That's proven by what we've got here today. I mean, at one point we had differences and now the planning commission is suggesting we don't distinguish. You know, I try to be as flexible, I'm looking to be as flexible as possible, but with absolute, you know, with protection of our natural areas. So I had sort of learned that there was a valid basis for treating the marine area with a much more cautious brush. I know that makes things more complicated, you know, and maybe it was a matter of simplicity to just try to keep it standardized. But I don't want to be overly I don't wanna have an overly heavy hand with lake owners that don't need it. I don't wanna have an overly permissive hand with marine owners when we're trying to protect South Puget Sound and our special place that we occupy in this whole region. So it makes me nervous, you know, to try to standardize it. I mean, what's good for Long Lake or, you know, Lawrence Lake versus the Puget Sound on Eld Inlet, you know, it's hard for me to believe it's exactly the same thing.
Well, one thing to keep in mind too, in addition to the buffers, the Shoreline Master Program lays out the permit requirements. So whether you're allowed to do something on a given type of water in a specific environment, and then what are the rules that you follow, and those are prescriptive in the document and do differ somewhat between lake and marine shoreline. I think if you drill down to the type of permit you need in the marine versus lake and the rules you follow, you will see that there is a higher level of protection for marine shorelines than lakes, and that's something that the Planning Commission spent a lot of time on. That's something that we heard a lot from the public, is to really look at these things and try to differentiate what's the best set of rules for each environment, because they are not identical in, you know, the issues that they face.
I'll ask one more question and then I'll pass my seatmates. So in understanding these 4 designations, I understand what natural means and I understand what shoreline residential means. But what would be an urban concern? Like, how much are we imposing on people's, you know, like who falls into urban conservancy and rural conservancy?
Sure, so the way that the inventory and characterization and shoreline environment designation assignments were done was to look at what are the areas that are the most intact, and those should be considered natural if they meet the criteria. What are the areas that are most developed? Those should be considered shoreline residential, and whatever is left out of that would fall into either the urban or the rural conservancy environments. And quick rule of thumb is that if you're not shoreline residential and you're not natural, but you are in an urban growth area, you would be urban conservancy. If you're out in the rural county, you're rural conservancy. So there's a recognition that there is some level of impact in those environments, but they're not fully built out to the degree that they should be designated shoreline residential. Therefore, they fall into one of those 2, urban or rural conservancy, depending on the specific geographic location.
So it's kind of like 3 categories and then that one's broken up based on
Correct.
whether you're in.
And that's so that's one of the things that our current Shoreline Master Program does not do. Ecology came around and said, you know, we have a recommended menu of designations and split out urban and rural conservancy, and that was many years ago. That was passed in state law as guidelines, and our master program does not do that. So we only have conservancy. This is an attempt to modernize and be in
Why
line
don't
with
we
those
just
guidelines.
adopt what the state did?
Sorry?
Why don't we just adopt what the state did then?
Well, because shoreline master programs are to be, can be tailored and are supposed to be tailored to individual communities. So we took a look at earlier in the process at all the different designations that we could do and applied the ones to the county that made the most sense. For example, we don't have any urban marine shorelines just because we don't, you know, we are a rural county. City of Olympia or other cities may have urban designations, like for the port. We don't have that level of development in our shorelines that necessitated the use of that environment. So the draft only reflects the ones that are the most appropriate for Thurston County.
So I think though, does the state have recommended or prescriptive buffers?
No, they do not have prescriptive buffers, no.
They have categories, and that's what we are suggesting. They don't have the specific buffers. That's our job in the county to determine.
As a comparison though, out of Boston Harbor, for an example, that's about as urban as you can get, but it's outside of the UGA.
It is, and a lot of that area is designated shoreline residential. So it already reflects that it is the most developed, and if you were to build out there on the majority of those lots with this, if this update as it is was adopted, a lot of those areas would have a 50-foot buffer. And there aren't a lot of undeveloped lots that are out there, but
In the process here, did we look at Mason County and Kitsap County and different
Yes.
ones?
Yep,
And
absolutely.
try and maybe plagiarize what they had or see if it fits?
I should send you a link to Kitsap County's documents. You would see a lot of striking similarities. So yeah, at the time, the draft was based on, we took a look at Kitsap County and as one that had been recently approved by Ecology and tailored that to fit the unique things in Thurston County But yes, that's a standard practice that we look at is who's got a good example and what can we use and apply for our
And then
specific.
what kind of exemptions are we allowed to do? The individual that bought a lot and did not, I'll just use a lot on a lake, did not develop it, but bought it, I don't know, family bought it 50 years ago. And they're waiting to do their dream thing. Are we coming along and saying, well, you can't, even though everybody else has done their thing? Is that where we're going?
There really isn't a hard no, and the legislature allows for what are called preferred uses of the shoreline, and residential development is one of those. So the master program is intended to accommodate residential development, but also protect the shorelines. So in a situation where you have a lot that is, say it's totally encumbered by the buffer and you really couldn't build on it without hitting that buffer, there are provisions in the document that allow you to encroach on that buffer, and you have to mitigate, and there are permits to apply for, but there is a pathway. And one of the pieces that ecology came back with as a recommendation is there are specific carve-outs in state law that let you do those types of things without requiring a variance like you might for another use. And so that's an option that's in the matrix here that the board could elect to do specifically for homeowners, and we certainly would recommend that, but yeah, so
The planning commission, that's what they recommended?
that actually came out of the review that happened after the planning commission recommendation. So we've got some things that we could recommend for the draft that would allow even more flexibility specifically for residential homeowners.
We've had changes to the plan since the planning commission looked at it?
There have not been changes made. You've got the planning commission recommendation. We've got suggestions. We've got things that could be implemented that are included in this matrix, and at the board's direction, we would make those changes prior to your public hearing.
So you have the flexibility to add or subtract from the planning commission's recommendations. One of those is just what you're saying, is allowing flexibility for folks on properties. And it's within this. The main decision points are at the top, and then helpful and other items are further down.
Let me ask you this, was there any discussion about forest practice on this whole thing?
Forest practices are one piece that the master program talks about. I believe the conversation was centered on those types of uses that the county has jurisdiction to speak to. But yes, there are standards in the draft that speak to forest practices, and the planning commission had several rounds of review on the draft, so they did go through it.
I mean, the reason I'm not too thrilled about DNR being involved or utilizing them, because they've got a vested interest. They're gonna go into the chemical business themselves here pretty quick. So, I mean, they aren't likely to give us a break on that.
So the reason I'm kind of wanted to highlight each one of the items is because you'll see the next one, where the first one says, yeah, maybe depending upon the details. The second one says that the shoreline modification practices are inconsistent with the purpose of management. So there are places where ecology has relayed that what the draft as it currently stands may not be acceptable. And I want to make sure that the board sees at least each one of these main issues so that you're prepared to dive deeper when you do the research on your own and then provide us detailed questions. But I don't want to shortchange the others. I just want to be mindful of the time.
So we have 15 minutes left, so let's go over, Andrew, the items. And then after that, we'll try to go through each of the commissioners' questions and schedule an additional work session on what comes next. Because we're definitely not on providing guidance yet. So with that, let's go to decision point number 2.
So there has been a lot of discussion throughout the process about where to allow certain shoreline modifications, things like docks or beach stairs, and how they should be permitted. So specifically here, what we're talking about in this decision point, again, is the natural shoreline environment. So those areas that are the most ecologically intact, they're the most free of structures or intensive human uses. Earlier drafts prohibited a lot of these things in the natural environment, which is consistent with the current master program. Changes have been made to the draft over time. The Planning Commission recommendation allows things like individual docks and beach stairs and floats to occur in that natural environment. Ecology's general position has been that these areas should remain largely free of structures. And they've stated that allowing that is inconsistent with the purpose and management of policies of the WAC as it relates to these environments. So this is something that may come back as a required change, and I've done the best I can to sort of telegraph what that position may be from ecology, but they have concerns about allowing those uses in this environment. So the board's potential options could be to retain what's in the planning commission recommendation, or to change permit requirements. So keeping the PC recommendation would generally allow more structures in these areas. Changing those permit requirements and adopting something like ecology's recommendations would allow fewer. So that's kind of the dial for the board, is more or fewer of these allowances in these natural environments. And I'll stop there.
So that's that topic. We can dive deeper or move on to the next as an intro.
Let's review the 5 items and then let's go back to each item. I just want to make sure that at least we cover the 5 main points.
Okay, decision point 3, and this is development standards for mooring structures. That should say development standards, I apologize.
Not dimensional.
Correct, dimensional are part of. So development standards, yes. So earlier drafts of the master program included specific development standards for mooring structures. So if you're building a dock or a pier, something like that, there were specific standards in the draft that spoke to the materials you could use, how big they could be, the methods of construction, those sorts of things. The Planning Commission recommended removing those in favor of providing a reference to state requirements under the hydraulic project approval, which if you're working in the water is something you need anyway, in addition to shoreline permits from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So Ecology has said this could be a workable approach, but staff do have concerns about the implementation and putting county staff in a place to be implementing another agency's requirements. Also, if there's a strict reference to the WAC and those WACs change, potentially those could change to things that may be inconsistent with the Shoreline Management Act, because those are 2 completely different pieces of legislation. So really the main question for the board here is, should the document contain a reference to these state requirements, or should it contain similar language in the document itself that is consistent with those state requirements?
So it just makes it more complicated for current planning to go and try and find those every time.
That's the concern, yeah. Number 4 is, relates to legally non-conforming development. Master programs are required to address legally existing non-conforming development. For example, you have a house that was built in the shoreline way before the rules were in place, and now it does not meet those requirements. This is one of the top issues brought up by the public. The Planning Commission spent a lot of time on this one. A lot of comments suggested that the draft should call non-conforming structures, uses, and lots conforming, to use the word conforming instead of non-conforming, to avoid any potential stigma over the use of that word non-conforming. So the Planning Commission recommendation applies the word conforming to all of these types of legally existing development. Ecology has said that approach is inconsistent with the Shoreline Management Act and would not be approvable as drafted. However, there is a carve-out in state law specifically for single-family residences, again, where the document could refer to those structures as conforming. They're still required to meet all the requirements of the master program, but use that term conforming in that one limited instance, Wee County. So the options for the board, really this is a question of terminology. It's what terminology does the board want to put forward? And options could be to proceed with the Planning Commission recommendation draft of conforming. Option 2 would be to refer to residential structures as conforming, but per statute, and refer to everything else as legally non-conforming. Option 3, use some other alternative reference throughout, such as non-conforming, legally existing non-conforming. So there's terminology that the board can play with here. We just cannot call everything conforming. That's not consistent with state law, but some things could be residential uses and everything else would have to be something else. But to soften the blow of that word non-conforming, the board can add.
As this thing's been moving forward, does Travis give you advice about, this is a taking, unless we compensate or something like that, this will develop litigation? Do you have those discussions with legal? Because you just, if you just take somebody's property rights, a lot of times you might be in a pinch.
Our legal counsel is supportive of the process continuing to move forward. Have we engaged specifically on the conforming or non-conforming question?
I don't think so, but they will certainly be reviewing everything before it, you know, goes forward
Yeah,
for.
but I think you'd wanna highlight that for sure, that
It's right here. It's the number 4.
Yeah, this is one of the big topics, and non-conforming is a standard term that's used in many other county codes, but here we have an option to do something different should the board choose to alleviate some of those concerns that the public has.
Pretty narrow.
Narrow, but
But-
yes, and I would also add, you know, we can also include some language in the SMP that is just explanatory of what it means if something is non-conforming, that it's essentially grandfathered. We can put some explanation in there and develop some educational materials
and
around
then
this.
ecology would be okay with that if you put it in there that,
They are not okay with calling something that is non-conforming conforming, unless it's the specific carve-out in state law, which
they
is for
want you to
residential.
tear it down or?
No, none of this is to say that you can tear down or anything, it's how we label these things for the purposes of
Well, then you
implementing
can't
the
get
master
you
program.
can't get a permit for a stairway or, I don't know, for adding a bedroom or
So
it's non-conforming.
and we'll probably cover this in later work sessions, but one thing that the draft actually does is include a lot more flexibility for these types of properties versus what you have today. Today, if your home is in the shoreline and burns down or something like that, there are real concerns about how can you build back. What the draft does is basically look at your footprint and say, if you're working in that footprint and you're not causing issues outside of that, you're allowed to do it. The draft also says if you want to expand, there's a lot more flexibility for those types of things. Really, all we're talking about here in this specific point is what are we calling
But
this?
it did sound like there's a conflicting state law on one of your points that you said there was a conflict. So shouldn't that be at least referenced in there, RCW 1234 or whatever? Ought to be, at least let the public know or,
WAC
Absolutely.
173-26-191. But
Just, I know we all have a lot of questions
Yeah.
about all of these items, so I just wanna make sure that at least we cover the 5 points and then,
The last one, yeah, I will try to stay real high up because this one's explicitly or very nuanced. It's about shoreline stabilization, which is bulkheads, things of that nature. This was a very widely discussed topic. The main question for the board here is really what types of permits should be required for these uses? And should things like bulkheads be allowed in those natural environments? So previous versions of the draft required a conditional use permit for all stabilization. That is a more rigorous review and requires ecology approval. The planning commission recommendation allows
Sorry, which one is more rigorous or?
conditional use permit. Yeah. The planning commission recommendation allows more stabilization without a conditional use permit. Ecology has recommended that we require those conditional use permits in more circumstances. So really, those are the options for the board, is to retain what we have now in the planning commission draft, to incorporate permit requirements recommended by ecology and potentially require more review of those types of things, or to revert to a previous draft and do some combination thereof. So that's a very high-level summary. It's very nuanced, but that's the main issue here.
so here's what I'd say is we try to put everything that should be or could be discussed by the Board of County Commissioners. We know this is a heavy lift, but we wanted full transparency to have this dialogue. This is a big deal. Other boards haven't been able to even come to this step. So recognizing that we know it's complicated, Andy's explanations can sometimes also, because they're so nuanced, be complicated as well. But we wanted to make sure that you had all the information. When you ask if there's a WAC reference, when you ask how this came about, it's in this document. When you want to know how come this, are we referencing state law? Andy's done a really good job of providing those references as well as the reference location in the SMP. And so we're gonna do what we can to provide you the guideposts to get the answers that you're looking for. But the reason that this is so big is because we wanna make sure that it covers everything that we know might be a concern and to get you to a product that ecology has an opportunity to review and potentially approve. So we understand it's a big deal, heavy lift. We're open to as much dialogue as the board needs, of course, as always,
we have 4 minutes left.
for today.
just talk about
Right.
this.
I know that I know I have a lot of questions in regards to this. So are there any questions that staff really needs to research that you think staff needs to know now, that way we can prepare for the next work session?
I
Or they
also offer we could meet one-on-one with the commissioners as well to
If something comes up, I mean, staff is available to answer any questions that you may have. So if I may, for next meeting, and I don't know if the next meeting will finalize the process, but at least we'll begin the conversation on the 5 items that you heard today, the options that you have and the decision that you may want to take on those items. And then whether you like to approach the other 2 big elements as a bulk or as an individuals related to the ecology required items and what I call is the helpful items or optional items, and those are more flexible and as a group or of individuals.
I mean, I'm just gonna stick to process. How is it proposed that we're gonna get through? I mean, I think we could probably wade our way through these 5 issues. You know, there's a lot of nuances, but there's like 62 more in here. How are we gonna manage that? If the commissioners have, I mean, for me, like, if it's a ecology required item, I think the smart thing to do is to include it, but I haven't gone through those ones. If certain ones just seem way out of step with our values or our community needs and stuff, and the commissioners want to start bringing these up, how are we gonna navigate that?
That's kind of where the homework comes in. We need to, that's what we wanted to make sure that you had all the information and then for the board to make that decision on how you wanted to move forward.
Well, the homework has to conclude with a meeting with you folks that know something. You're giving us homework to look at it, but.
Homework just means a long list of questions from you.
Yeah,
No,
well,
but
that's exactly
your
right.
example is a good one. For instance, if the 5 items that you heard today may be, procedural. When you get to the required items by ecology, if something just actually, for some reason, really doesn't bring value from your perspective, the homework from staff is to reach out to ecology and ask that question. What will be the consequences if the Board of County Commissioners doesn't want to include this item?
And we've tried to do that already for
Right.
the board.
So, and that's probably perhaps a good example as to how the process could work.
Okay, it is 3 PM. I feel like we didn't really
Didn't get much done,
get
did
much
we?
done,
Really?
but
No.
This is huge. Like, this is a big step forward. Having the information,
I want to wrap it up because we do have an agenda review right after. Thank you, Chair, for coming today and answering some of our questions. Thank you to staff. 3 PM, we are adjourned.